Let's go next to West Hartford, Connecticut. Bill's with us. He's an amateur astronomer, and he knows his stuff. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, thank you, George. Thank you. Rod, let me get right to it. I have two fantastic speculative questions for you. Question number one, if Bobby Kennedy had been president, two terms of Robert F. Kennedy starting in 1968 and 1972. And the second question involves present-day President Donald Trump and Mars. So question number one, if Robert F. Kennedy had not been assassinated in, let's say, an alternative reality, and he were president instead of Richard M. Nixon. So in other words, instead of Richard M. Nixon and the Congress ending Apollos 18 and 19 and 20, I think Bobby Kennedy, being John F. Kennedy's brother, would have at least have kept 18 and 19, if not 18, 19, and 20. Maybe one Saturn V would have been a Skylab mission as well. But the point is, instead of Richard Nixon starting the space shuttle along with the Congress in 1971, Robert F. Kennedy might have continued or would have continued the Apollo program, even if it were just one mission per year until 1977, the late 70s, so that by now, 2017, I think would be ready to go to Mars next year in the 2018 launch window. And question number two on Donald Trump, who I did not vote for, I voted for Hillary Clinton. But the point is, would Donald Trump, because he's for infrastructure, be for space infrastructure in the sense that he might do for Mars what President John F. Kennedy did for the moon?
He hasn't said too much about space, Rod, has he?
Trump?
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean,
hasn't.
He did mention Mars in his inaugural address, or at least that day. There's been, of course, tons of speculation about this. I was in a working group of some NASA and people from the National Space Society that worked up a document to send to, they thought, Hillary at the time. Turned out to be Trump administration.
Just changed the name.
Talking about some of these things. Yeah, and it didn't really change much. I mean, the main gist of it is, let's let business do their thing. Let's get some infrastructure going in space so we can go there to stay. That's a very thumbnail version of it. Trump did mention Mars, and I think that would be a grand gesture on his part in his way of thinking. On the other hand, the transition team he's put in place seems to be very focused, at least before they stepped into NASA, where they are now, briefly, on going back to the moon, because that's something that we know is achievable, it's close, and we can do a lot of things there that may help us get to Mars ultimately. It could slow it down, but it could also make it safer and more effective and allow us to... There's a lot of resources on the moon, for instance. There's water frozen in the polar craters that are always in darkness.
Helium-2.
You've got water. There's helium-3, there's water, but where you've got water, you've got the constituents for rocket fuel, life support, all kinds of stuff that you need. There's a lot of metal in the lunar surface that could ultimately be smelted and made into things. So if you can just get us off this planet, which is the really hard part, is getting out of the Earth's gravity well, get into orbit, and get to the moon, and start working with things there, a lot of stuff can happen. So that one can go either way, but I think there is some pressure towards a return to the moon. On the Bobby Kennedy thing, which is really a fascinating question.
Let's answer that when we come back on RFK. What would have happened had he become president and not been assassinated when that tragedy occurred? We'll come back in a moment with Rod Pyle, author of Amazing Stories of the Space Race. Final segment just ahead, and we'll get to as many calls as we can. Next hour, Graham Hancock joins us as we talk about his latest work, Magicians of the Gods. I'm looking forward to that. We're going to come back in a moment, though, with Rod Pyle, author of Amazing Stories of the Space Age, and take your final calls. Welcome back to Coast. Rod Pyle with us. We'll get to this question about RFK. During the break, Rod, Greg from Missouri called us, didn't want to go on the air, said that he thinks it's some kind of stealth plane or craft that's been covered up being hauled someplace. Could be, huh?
Well, it was interesting about that question about the unidentified aircraft or rocket. I just got an email from my friend Tony Cook, who's the staff astronomer up at Griffith Observatory, who tells me that the Dream Chaser, which is a privately funded mini shuttle, was moved last week by truck to Edwards and would have been in a convoy about that time. So that makes a lot of sense.
How about that?
Well, it's a wild-looking spaceship, so that was probably what he saw. So I'm glad Tony wrote in.
RFK, had he lived, what would have happened?
Yeah. I think he would have probably given NASA a little bit more of their way, and their general plan was to keep using the Apollo hardware because it was good and it worked, develop it, augment it, and they had plans for extended lunar stays and maybe a base on the moon. They had a plan for a manned Venus flyby, which is kind of astounding. That's in my book. And they were planning to get to Mars using augmented versions of similar hardware by about 1986. And those things probably could have happened. Mars is a little tougher than we thought. Going to Venus would have been a little tougher than we thought because space doesn't like bags of wet meat, which is what people are. And we're finding out there's a lot of things out there that are a little worse on the body than we had predicted. Zero G is one of them. Radiation is a biggie. So that might have held us back for a while, but I think we would have figured it out with enough horsepower and enough cash.
Back to the calls we go.